Chapter 48. On the 29th of May, they turn eastward again, measuring offsets and marking them as they go. Now they begin the day sighting into the sun and watching their shadows at evening. Surveyor and tripod and instrument stretching back somehow toward the past, toward more youthful selves. Going west, even no further than Susquehanna, living by the simple diurnal rhythms, going ever with the sun, was not the same as this going against it. Aye, very different indeed, remarks Dixon. Mason is trying to wake up. The nearest coffee is in the cook tent. Pray you, he whispers, try not to be so damned. Did I say damned? I meant so fucking chirpy all the time. Good chap, stumbling out of the tent, trying to get his hair into some kind of cue. The coffee is brewed with the aid of a Fahrenheit thermometer, unmarked save at one place, exactly halfway between freezing and boiling at 122 degrees, where upon the wood a small arrow is inscribed, pointing at a scratch across the glass tube. 'Tis at this temperature that the water receives the ground coffee. The brew being stirred once or twice, the pot removed from the fire, its decoction then proceeding. Though clarifying may make sense in London, out here 'tis a luxury, nor are there always eggshells to hand. If tasted early, Dixon has found, the fine suspended matter in the coffee lends it an undeniable rustic piquance. Later, in the pot, the liquid charring itself toward vileness appeals more to those looking for bodily stimuli, like Dixon, who was able to sip the most degradedly awful pot's end poison and yet beam like an idiot. Best jamoke west of the Alleghenies, a phrase Overseer Barnes utters often, though neither surveyor quite understands it, especially as the party are yet east of the Alleghenies. Howbeit, at this point in a pot's life cycle, Mason prefers to switch over to tea, when it is Dixon's turn to begin shaking his head. Can't understand how anyone abides that stuff. How so? Mason, unable not to react. Well, it's disgusting, isn't it? Half-rotted leaves, scalded with boiling water, and then left to lie, and soak, and bloat. Disgusting? This is tea, friend. Cha. What all tasteful London drinks. That, pollicating the coffee pot, is what's disgusting. Au contraire, Dixon replies. Coffee is an art, where precision is all. Water temperature, mean particle diameter, ratio of coffee to water, or as we say, CTW, and dozens more variables I'd mention were they not so clearly out of thy technical grasp. How is it, Mason, pretending amiable curiosity, that of each pot of coffee only the first cup is ever worth drinking, and that by the time I get to it, someone else has already drunk it? Dixon shrugs. You must improve your speed. As to the other, why, aye, only the first cup's any good, owing to coffee's sacramental nature, the sacrament being penance. entirely absent from thy sunlit world of Tay, whereby the remainder of the pot, often dozens of cups deep, represent the price for enjoying that first perfect cup. Folly, gapes Mason. Why, every cup of tea is perfect. For what? Curing hides? For the next 3 weeks, they are occupied again with the enigmatic area round the tangent point, seeking to close the eastern boundaries of Pennsylvania and Maryland, the commissioners to appearance being anxious upon this score. They all live upon this side of Susquehanna, Mr. McLean conjectures. They don't want you across it just yet. Across it things are not so civilized, so Anglican, begging your pardon, sir, nor so Quaker, begging yours, sir, or should I say thine. Over Susquehanna begins a different province entirely, and beginning at the mountains, another differing from that, and so on, beyond Monongahela, beyond Ohio, though the betting in the taverns is overwhelmingly against your getting quite that far. Won't that depend upon how far the proprietors wish the line to run? Inquires Mr. Mason. If by the proprietors you mean those who truly own it, remarks John Harland. The Indians, suggests Mr. Dixon. The army, says Mr. Harland. I meant rather the Penns, Mason a bit starched, as Maryland's grant ends just past Laurel Hill. From there west 'tis Penn's line alone, dividing Penn lands from Virginia, who bear none of the cost. 5 degrees from the Atlantic coast, opines Mr. McLean. Will include Fort Pitt and the first few miles of Ohio before it bends south. Iron deposits, coal as well, underground mountain ranges of it, burning down there for centuries, known to the Indians, perhaps used as well in connection with their mysterious lead mines in the mountains. Right up your street, Mr. Dixon. The surveyors soon discover that the meridian drawn north from the tangent point will run slightly inside the 12-mile arc, crossing it twice at points about 1.5 miles apart, producing now between them 2 boundary lines, one straight and one about 1,000th of a mile longer, curved, which will one day be declared the legal boundary, thus whittling a tiny sliver from Maryland. The 3.5 miles to the west line remaining can be run as a piece of pure meridian, to be styled the North Line. All I know, Mason shrugs, is I'm supposed to line up Alioth and Polaris with the flame of a candle 1 mile away, being held by you, who at the same time must ever be bisecting the flame perfectly with the string of your plummet. Unless it sets the string on fire, of course. So Dixon is sent out into the darkness variable as the moon, thick with predators bestial and human, Indians upon missions forever secret from European eyes, all moving easily among this community of night, interrupted only by the odd, unscheduled idiot. Even animals are late to arrive at waterholes, and so run into others in the herd, away from whom the latecomers would as gladly have kept, and herd politics takes another strange and unforeseen turn. Through it all, there is the unsure and withal helpless assistant, moving his lanthorn about in the air, whilst a distant voice through a speaking trumpet bids him go right, then left. Frankly, Mason chuckles, by way of what he fancies encouragement, were I watching from the darkness, I shouldn't want to get too close to anyone in a peculiar hat, shouting in a loud metal voice. The savages may be as frightened of you as were the people in Cecil County last winter. 'Twasn't I that frightened 'em. They took me for the apprentice, no more. I saw you, deny it all you like. I saw you conversing with that torpedo. No, they were but more of thy visions, Mason. Thou were having them hourly by then, which is when, in fact, everyone grew frightened of thee. Another few days of bad weather, and he spreads his hands with a pitying gaze. At last, on June 6th, in a meadow belonging to Captain John Singleton, nearly 50 chains east of Mr. Rees Price's house, where the meridian and parallel intersect, the surveyors sink in a post, marked W upon the west side and N upon the north, and the boundary is closed. Here, at the northeast corner of Maryland, the geometrical pilgrim may well wish to stand in the company of his thoughts, at this purest of intersections marked so far upon America. Yet, geomancer, beware! If thy gaze but turn eastward by an eyelash's diameter, thou must view the notorious wedge, resulting from the failure of the tangent point to be exactly at this corner of Maryland, but rather some 5 miles south, creating a semi-cusp or thorn of that length and doubtful ownership, not so much claimed by any one province as prized for its ambiguity, occupied by all whose wish, hardly uncommon in this era of fluid identity, is not to reside anywhere. As a peaceful and meadow-like vista sweeps southward, the line and the arc approach one another, one may imagine, almost sensibly. Bearing in from either limb of sight, a thrum like peevish Dumbledores in flight, as great Tox has it in his Pennsylvaniad. Yet there remains to the wedge an unseen world, beyond resolutions, of transactions never recorded, upon creeksides and beneath hedges, in barns, lofts, and spring houses, in the long summer maize fields, where one may be lost within minutes of entering the vast, unforgiving thickets of stalks. Indeed, all manner of secret paths and clearings and alcoves are defined, pushed over or stamped into being, roofless as ruins, for but a few fugitive weeks of lull before autumnal responsibilities come again looming. The sun burns, the gravid short forests beckon, the soil, when enough is revealed, becomes another sand arena. Anybody may be in there, from clandestine lovers to smugglers of weapons, some hawking contraband, buckles, lockets, tea, laces from France, some marking off lots for use in some future piece of land jobbery. Insect pests are almost intimidated into leaving, but sooner or later come back. Nearby, withal, is Iron Hill, a famous and semi-magical magnetic anomaly, known to elf communities near and far, into which riskers of other people's capital have been itching for years to dig, but being reluctant to reward more than one set of provincial officials at a time, are waiting until the legal status of the wedge becomes clear. Is it part of Pennsylvania, Maryland, or of the new entity Delaware, which on paper at least belongs to Pennsylvania, William Penn's having leased it from the Duke for a term of 10,000 years, though it has enjoyed for 50 of these its own legislature and executive council. 'Tis no one's for the moment, a small geographic anomaly, a bustle with appetites high and low, their offerings and acceptances. The North Line quickly completed, the surveyors are ordered back to Susquehanna, this time to continue the West Line, as far as the country is inhabited. Legally, this suggests as far as the Proclamation Line at the crest of the Alleghanies, even before the party reaches the river, as if 'twere a fate neither could avoid. Darby and Cope are pretending to be Mason and Dixon, though not always respectively. It begins when someone, having observed the chain, assumes the obvious. "Mr. Mason! And this must be Mr. Dixon." "Not exactly," says Cope. "He means," Darby hastily puts in, "that he's Mason and I'm Dixon. Isn't that right, Mason?" "I'd prefer to be Dixon," hisses Cope. "Next time, all right?" The links of the chain caked with dry dirt and squeaking almost painfully. "You'll want to take care," they're eventually warned by a friendly tapster. "There are a couple of lads about pretending to be you." "Get on," says Darby. "Why should anyone wish to be us?" wonders Cope. Maidens, in varying ratios of indignation to curiosity, show up in camp demanding to see Mason or Dixon, or both. Upon meeting the real surveyors, "Well, but you're not him, nor you the other." "Of course not," reply Mason and Dixon, when they have a moment to talk about it together. "It must be someone in camp," Mason suggests. "My guess is 'tis Darby and Cope." "How then?" "Well, they're never about, are they, when all these folk show up to complain? And their names, like ours, are usually spoken together. Yet you know more of chain men than I. What think ye?" "The chain man sorrows," it seems to Dixon. "All proceed from being forbidden, but upon sufferance of the party chief, so much as to touch any instrument excepting the chain, with centuries of that word's poetic associations adding to its weight. Farmers in Durham aren't the only ones who call it the devil's guts. Chain men bear it, they hate it, they tend it carefully, their feelings ever in a muddle. They cannot keep from sliding queer, covetous glances at the other instruments. They understand the surveyor's injunction, yet touch they must, and will, some honestly wishing to learn more of the arts, others merely to fiddle with the equipment. That Messrs. Darby and Cope, being, here in America, surveyors, fully competent with all instruments, should now toil as chain men, under British supervision withal. Invidious situations arise, do thou see. Then shall we break with tradition, perhaps allow them to use our surveying instruments, or yours, rather, as I possess none of my own." "Eh? What? My circumferenter? Why, 'tis another part of my very senses. 'Twould be like letting someone else do my smelling for me." "So, you and this instrument are quite close, then. Do you have a name that you call it by? Mason, the thought of either Darby's or Cope's eyeball dripping fluids all over the lenses of my old Cirque. Ha! Old Cirque! How charming you people are! How childlike in your attachments! Perhaps, if the tools of thy trade had ever belonged to thee instead of to the king, thou might at least once have felt this simple, sentimental bond. Quite common among the people, in fact, though scarcely, I guess, among all those great public zenith sectors and telescopes and so forth, up there but a footfall from the highest in the land. Mason drops his head in false apology. Yet another flaw. How many more before my character's too riddled for it to matter? Dixon, I know I am not worthy to carry your esteemed instrument. Blessing upon you both, and much joy of your relationship. Thank ye, Mason. I mean that sincerely. As to our chainmen, they being qualified lens folk, might we not allow them some time with the sector, neither of us actually owning it? Fine with me, but I've but its custodians to report to. You must answer to its maker. John Bird would do the same, I'm certain. Deferring as ever in matters of character, Mason making mock French flourishes in the air with his hat. Why, here are the gents themselves, a miracle. Fetch me the Jesuit telegraph, for I must report it to the Pope. How now, boys? Far too truculent, mutters Mason. Mr. Cope, Mr. Darby, well met. We prefer Darby and Cope, actually, says Darby. He being the head and all, adds Cope. Of course, that's only east to west, depending who ends up with the starbs, really. Going on to describe in foul copy Steichomythia their practice of exchanging 10 small wood stakes to keep the chain count accurate, though between Mr. Darby's habit of keeping stobs everywhere about him, including in his belt, leggings, and hat, and Mr. Cope's forgetfulness in counting, they have grown so fearful of stob losses as to have begun exchanging stobs after 11 chains instead of 10, with Mr. Cope then passing back only 9 of his and keeping 1. Yet now one and now the other will forget and revert to the old 10-chain method. We may be miles off by now, Dixon's eyes having grown very round. Save that through some dark miracle of Mathesis, says Darby, our errors have ever exactly cancelled out. Else Susquehanna measured to Potomac might haply maze the traveller loxodromic. With phantom leagues too many or too few, as if a very hole in space twere two. A pause, not a mischievous dimple upon either phiz. All content otherwise? Mason, as he imagines, smoothly. Go easy, Mason. Don't upset them. 'Twas him that made me do it, screams Mr. Cope, as if yielding before a sudden stress. Booby, ejaculates Mr. Darby. 'Twas you began it. Yet head everything must you ever be, mustn't you, leaving poor miserable Cope to shift as he may? Made thee do what? Inquires Dixon. Aha! You see? Cries Mason. Now are they confessing? Actually, the chainmen are fallen rather to thumping one the other as Mason and Dixon look on. Then again, confides Mason behind his hand, a turn at the sector mightn't be such a good idea. Not just now. There is a commotion up the Visto. A delegation of newly hired axemen come marching in. Here are the very subjects, cries one of these. Now then, ye heathen, hold. 'Tis not how we Christians settle our differences. Yet they seem like white men. Cleverly, indeed fiendishly disguised, though Darby and Cope are not quite British names, are they? Why, they are as British as anyone here, Dixon points out. Not according to your pay list. See here, it reads, Darby and Cope, Chinamen. That's chain men. Ah, not the same. Oh dear. Is Mr. Barnes but fun-mongering and we the gulls? Pity, really. None of us has seen a Chinaman before. Soon, promises the oracular Squire Hulligast, in a voice so charged with passion that immediately all but the most desperate of the axemen believe him. By the 22nd of June they are back below the Peach Bottom Ferry, another Saturday night, ready to start west again. There rushes the river, both surveyors understanding by now 'tis not only a river, being as well the boundary to another country. Next day they measure southward about 45 feet to correct their error in latitude. And there placed a mark, and in the direction of this and the mark on the east side of the river we proceeded to run the line. Just before they cross Susquehanna, a parcel arrives for them by way of a lathered youth riding express upon a black barb, neither showing any sign of tiring. With a terrible "Yee-haw!" the youth sweeps off his tricorn, wheels, and has galloped back into the brush. In the package is Friar Boscovich's book, De Solis et Lunae Defectibus, published at last, on the eclipses of the sun and the moon, printed in London 1760. Dispatched transatlantically by Maskelyne, who in the jobation accompanying invites their attention to a great variety of data within, including a warning as to the attraction of mountains. In Italy, 'twas established that the Umbrian Apennines caused a very considerable deviation of the plumb line northward, as the party moving in that direction drew ever closer. First the iron loads disable my needle, moans Dixon. Now the mountains are about to throw off my plummet. Obliging us, as Maskelyne and me at St. Helena, to take symmetrical readings on the opposite sides of the crests, and hope that the two errors will cancel out. I pray the western slopes of Allegheny may prove less distressing than the windward side of that wretched island.